Map 11-16, Crayer 2. The enemy moved from Sarkani at night in two columns. One column moved against the Mujahideen Fatah base, and the other moved deeper in a flanking maneuver to the rear of my defenses and tried to climb the heights of Spina Soka Mountain. The column headed toward the Fatah base climbed the ridge from the east. There was a security outpost there consisting of 10 to 12 men sleeping in a tent and a small hut. The enemy soldiers silently approached the guard and killed him without making any noise. The other Mujahideen at the outpost were fast asleep and were caught by surprise. The enemy was killing them when some of them woke up and a shootout ensued. The Mujahideen at Fatah died to the last man. The noise from the gunfire alerted the rest of my Mujahideen. The second enemy column had not yet reached the crest of Spina Soka Mountain. My Mujahideen occupied fighting positions and met the approaching enemy with heavy fire. A fierce battle continued throughout the night. The enemy column was deep in our positions, but we had cut off his withdrawal routes. We expected to bloody the enemy as he fought to reopen his withdrawal routes. Instead, the enemy column continued over the mountain path all the way to Pashad, some 20 kilometers southwest of Sarkani. We did not expect the enemy to withdraw in that direction. Meanwhile, my Mujahideen directed heavy fire on the enemy at the Fatah base, and it began a fighting retreat back to Sarkani. By dawn, the enemy had withdrawn from the Crayer base and taken his dead and wounded with him. Mujahideen losses included 18 killed and 20 wounded. Again, about 25% casualties. Commentary. The Soviet DRA commander did a good job on analyzing the pattern set by his forces in the area. Using this stereotype, the DRA commander caught the Mujahideen commander by surprise, even though he had been warned. The Soviet DRA, reluctant to move and fight at night and reliant on readily identifiable terrain for night movement. Therefore, he advanced stealthily at night over unexpected approaches. This gave him tactical surprise and allowed him to wipe out a critical Mujahideen outpost virtually without resistance. However, his apparent lack of coordination between the two columns disclosed his attack prematurely and denied victory the second column. Had both columns been in position and launched their attacks simultaneously, they might have achieved better results. The Mujahideen were asleep despite sufficient warnings because they reacted to a stereotype and pattern. Mujahideen actions, once alerted, were commendable, particularly in cutting off the obvious Soviet DRA route of withdrawal. Whether the Soviet DRA commander's original plan included withdrawal over the Pashad mountain route, or whether it was a decision that he made on the spot, it clearly saved the force from some heavy casualties. Had the Mujahideen also blocked the Pashad route, the Soviet DRA force might have been in very serious trouble and faced possible elimination. Vignette 14. The Fall of Chagni Base Camp by Commander Abdul Razak, Haji Pir Mohammed, and Amir Mohammed. Chagni Base Camp is in Shari Safad district, about 10 kilometers from Highway 1, the main highway from Kabul to Kandahar. We normally set ambushes on the south side of the road, since the north side is open between Shari Safa and Kalat. There is only one place optimum for ambush, a 6-kilometer stretch where a dry riverbed parallels the roadway. We could hide many Mujahideen in the high ground overlooking the road, and escort vehicles could not cross the riverbed to get up into our ambush positions, since the dry riverbanks were like sheer walls. Although no APC or tank could get across, we mined the area between the road and the riverbed anyway. The high ground of Sher Ali Khan Mountain protected our withdrawal. Further, there were no villages or villagers nearby to provide warning to the enemy. We built permanent fighting positions at this site, and we ambushed the enemy at this site continually, but they always seemed surprised. The enemy convoy would usually reach our ambush site in the late afternoon, since they left Kabul about 0800. The enemy usually sent tanks, BMPs, and APCs to escort their convoys. We normally positioned our heavy weapons on favorable ground higher up and positioned our small arms forward. At the point that we usually laid our ambushes, there was one road that intersected our area. It had to cross the riverbed, but we usually mined that road as well for good measure. The normal reaction of the enemy convoy when ambushed was to drive off the road to the north to get out of range of our weapons. They never tried to attack us. Their trucks would be burning and destroyed, everything would be in chaos, and everyone was looking to his own survival. There was no coordinated response. Escort tanks and APCs would fire at random, but they would never dismount troops and push them forward. Then enemy aircraft would arrive and make strafing runs, but it would be too late because darkness would be falling. Our group and Chogni base camp was a real thorn in the side of the enemy. It was in the year of Islam Dara, October 1986, that the Soviets captured our base at Chogni. Our commander, Abdul Razak, was not at the base but was visiting other Mujahideen in Kandahar and Helmand with a representative of our faction headquartered in Peshawar. At 0400 hours, the enemy dropped illumination flares that lit up the area like it was day. Everybody was sleeping at Chogni except for the sentries. The enemy followed this with an air and MRL bombardment. Early in the morning, helicopters came and landed troops at 4 LZs, map 11-17 Chogni. Some 45 helicopters were involved. These 4 LZs were located on the high ground to secure the flanks for their advancing tanks and infantry. When the air assault forces reported that the way was clear, the tanks and mechanized infantry moved from Shar-e-Safa. The artillery fire and airstrikes were so heavy that they probably assumed that no one was left alive. The Soviets had moved earlier from Kandahar to Shar-e-Safa. Now, the enemy ground column came from Shar-e-Safa south to Kadu, where they turned east in the canyon between Mayantak Gar and Karawe Gar mountains. Air assault forces on these heights safeguarded their passage. The movement of the enemy was very slow since they waited as the air assault forces moved along the high ground to secure passage for them. They reached Kadu in the morning. It took them from 0800 to 1600 hours to travel the remaining 11 kilometers from Kadu to our base. At the end of the canyon was the village of Mayu. There, the ground column split. The main body continued east toward the village of Bandakai. Our base camp was to the east of Bandakai, located in a saddle between the Kaki Gar and Dumanore Gar mountains. Again, air assault forces on the heights safeguarded their passage. The other part of their column was a flanking detachment. It turned south at Mayu through the village of Shabed and then to the south of Dumanare Gar mountain to block our escape and to shoot at our base. Their tanks reached our base in the afternoon. As they neared our position, they put in the 5th and 6th LZ to not only secure their advance, but also to attack down from the high ground. Haji Pir Mohammed was using a ZGU on Hill 1722. Amir Mohammed engaged a helicopter coming toward them, but missed. The helicopter went over the crest of the hill where Abdul Ghani was waiting with an RPG. Abdul yelled that the helicopter was landing infantry and he would get it. He shot it with his RPG. Only 4 or 5 personnel had gotten out of the helicopter when he hit it. The remains of that helicopter were there for more than a year. We had deployed our forces to maximize the firepower of our 7 82mm recoilless rifles, 5 ZGU-1 machine guns, 6 Dishka machine guns, and many RPG-7s. We also had some mortars, but we could not use the mortars very well. A mortar is good against a stationary target, but is hard to use against a moving target. Most of the fighting was between their armored vehicles and our recoilless rifles and RPGs. They were so close that we could hear their Russian voices. They were also using loudspeakers, telling us to surrender since our plight was hopeless and we would be killed. That language was Pashto from their Afghans. We answered these broadcasts with fire and destroyed 7 tanks and APCs. We shot down 1 jet and they intensified their fire. As they launched their attacks against us, they would show their location to the supporting aircraft with red smoke. This kept their own aircraft from attacking them. Night fell and everything was confused and chaotic as we lost command and control. No one knew where the Soviets were and where the Mujahideen were. We Mujahideen fought on until 0200 or 0300 hours in the morning. Then, as we ran out of ammunition, we began to slip away to the northeast. A close friend of Pir Mohammed's was standing close to him when he was killed. Pir Mohammed carried his body to high ground, where he left the body in a safe place and left the area. There were 220 Mujahideen in the base. We had 22 KIA, 21 of our Mujahideen, and 1 guest who was spending the night at our base. Most of the 198 survivors escaped to the northeast. The Soviets now owned the base. They spent 24 hours there, looted it, and destroyed as much of our installations as they could. Before Commander Razak had left Chagny, he had sent groups out to scout the road. They reported that the roads from Kandahar and Argistan were closed. He sent out scouts again the next night, and they reported that the roads were still blocked. The next day, toward late afternoon, he sent a Shar-e Safa. He went to Shar-e Safa by tractor, and then north into the mountains, and then turned and followed the Arghandab River valley down to Kandahar. The trip took 5 days. At Kandahar, he discovered that the airport was very busy as waves of aircraft flew in and out. He was told that the ground detachment had also left and was headed northeast. He did not have much communications at that time. In the late afternoon, he learned that the fighting was focused at his base. He went to his other bases in Kandahar and gathered Mujahideen and MRL. He then took the same circuitous route back to his base. As they reached Shar-e Safa, the Soviets had already gone, so he sent his Kandahar reinforcements back and went on to Chagny. The survivors were gone, and those left were all dead. It was a mess. Everything destroyed or damaged, booby traps and mines were all over the area. Gradually, the surviving Mujahideen returned. Commander Razak decided that this was no longer a safe place for a permanent base and converted it to a mobile base for 50 Mujahideen. 5 days after we buried our dead, we packed 150 rockets and went to exact revenge on the Kandahar airport. One night, some 2 weeks later, we buried our rockets or put them in hideouts or safe houses near Kosab to the north of the airfield. We had to do this very secretly as we did not want the locals to know. The next night, we set up our 150 rockets with remote control firing devices aimed at the airfield. The remote control firing devices were essential because it is impossible to stay in the open area after firing. The first salvo of 50 rockets fired at night. After the first salvo, planes took off and hit the area at random. The next salvo fired at sunrise, and the third salvo at 0700 hours, about 1 hour later. After each salvo of 50 rockets, plane would fly over and shoot at random, but there were no Mujahideen in the area. After the third salvo, the enemy sent armored vehicles into the area to search. They encircled the area and sent dismounted infantry into the cordon. They found the spent launchers. Most of the Soviet aircraft losses were from rocket attacks on planes parked on the ground, not from air defense. This attack reportedly damaged many aircraft. Before Stingers, Soviet and Chinese SA-7s proved very ineffective. We only brought down 2 aircraft in the Kandahar area with SA-7s. Commentary. The Soviet advance on Chagny was slow, but the Soviets were finally learning to dominate the high ground before they moved their ground force. Apparently, the Soviets had good intelligence to support this attack. However, the Soviets did not block all escape routes, and the bulk of the Mujahideen force escaped. Mujahideen reconnaissance, on the other hand, was lacking, and they were surprised. Still, the Mujahideen had plenty of time to hit the Soviets or evacuate their base during the slow Soviet advance. They took few precautions and were not aggressive in contesting the Soviet advance. The Mujahideen showed a lack of command and control, reflecting the absence of their leader and a working chain of command. Further, the commander had not trained his mortar crews in engaging moving targets. Chapter Commentary. The Mujahideen safe havens in Pakistan and Iran were absolutely essential for the survival of their force. Pakistan was particularly important since most of the external aid came through Pakistan. These safe havens allowed the Mujahideen a place to shelter their families, resupply, treat their wounded, train, sell war booty to support their families, rest, and exchange tactical information and intelligence. Pakistan provided forward supply depots near the border, and the Mujahideen built most of their major supply depots near the Pakistan border. These Mujahideen major supply depots were a constant target of the Soviets and DRA. In some areas, the Mujahideen developed forward supply depots and tried to move most of the supplies forward. In contested areas, the Mujahideen moved their forward supply depots about to avoid capture. The major supply depots, however, were stationary and vulnerable. A dictum of guerrilla warfare is that the guerrilla should not hold ground. Mujahideen logistics forced the Mujahideen to hold ground. Mujahideen defenses were built around heavy crew-served weapons. The popular image of the guerrilla is a small force carrying an assortment of small arms. Most insurgencies start that way, but successful insurgencies need heavy weapons. The problem with heavy weapons is that they and their ammunition are hard to transport. The Mujahideen became very adept at field fortifications and developed shelters which protected them from intense air and artillery attack. On the other hand, throughout the war, the Mujahideen had difficulty fighting air and artillery systems and had to learn how to survive them, particularly when defending. The introduction of the Stinger man-portable air defense missile in 1986 provided upgraded Mujahideen air defense and forced the Soviets to change their aerial tactics to avoid losing aircraft. Soviet assaults on Mujahideen defenses were initially hampered by their reluctance to fight at night, their over-reliance on firepower at the expense of maneuver, and their reluctance to operate far from their armored vehicles. As the war progressed, the Soviets developed better light infantry, began conducting more night combat, and more skillfully employed air assault and ground combat tactical elements together. Still, throughout the war, the Soviets were hampered by lack of sufficient infantry forces.